Hello! You're watching the Great Canadian Bagel here, and today we have another Canadian federal election forecast. Now, before I begin, I'd like to let everyone know I am running yet another poll for Canadian federal elections. I'm also going to do Ontario, Quebec, and if sample for size permitting, Newfoundland. I don't expect there to be any provincial elections for those three, except possibly Newfoundland, because I believe they have to have one this year anyways. But people were asking, and if I'm going to do a federal one anyways, because we're close to we might see a federal election in the next few months, so polling is interesting. So make sure you fill it out, share with anyone else. If you have already received the link, because you're on the mailing list, I have fixed it. For some reason, Google Forms decides to not give permission by default anymore. You have to manually set it as the person who made the form. I don't know why you would have a survey form that you need permission to use, but that's Google for you. And one final thing before I would begin, I'm going to do an experiment for the first quarter of this year, so January, February, March. The last Friday of the month, I'm going to do a Q&A video. And in those videos, you can submit to me questions in the comments below. Just title it Q&A if you want it answered in the Q&A. And if you do any super chats or super stickers or whatever it's called, the comments with money in it, I will answer those priority, and everyone who's a member of Everything Bagel tier or higher will get a free question that you can ask on the Discord. If I don't get good viewership on this after the first 3 months, I'm going to stop doing this, and I'll let you guys know. But we're going to give it a trial for 3 months, and I'll be answering these in a live stream. But no further ado, let us begin with the video. So we are potentially now in the dying days of the Liberal government. Now, you could have said that for a while now, but now it really does feel like the dying days. Ontario, Quebec, Maritime caucuses are trying to resist Trudeau or complaining with him they want to replace him with someone else. The Liberal polling numbers are collapsing, and the NDP is not replacing it. These numbers are just going to the Conservatives and the Bloc. And if you look into long-term projections, which you can kind of do by increasing recency bias, things don't look any better. In fact, they look a lot worse. So this is what I have here with normal bias. So the normal amount of recency bias for the current time period, this is the map I get. If I increase recency bias significantly, instead I get this one. And as you can tell, there's 14 more Conservative seats, there's 2 more Bloc seats, there's 2 less NDP, and there's 14 less Liberal seats. The Liberals are basically just holding out in Winnipeg North, Surrey Newton, a few parts of downtown Toronto and Scarborough, the island of Montreal itself, and a few odd urban sites and Acadian ridings in Atlantic Canada. The NDP is not doing much better. I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see a bit easier. They've only picked up 2 ridings in Toronto at the cost of losing 20 or 15 other ridings. 16 other ridings. They've also picked up Halifax Centre. Things really are not doing good for either party. But we're not going to dwell too hard on the high recency bias scenario, because it is less valid for today. It is an interesting peek into the future, but I don't think it's as valid as a scenario as what I have right here for January 6th, when this video is being released. Now, this is quite an interesting position, because we can kind of see here, I have my last video for December 9th. And that wasn't a great point for the Liberals. They'd already dropped a good amount because the GST holiday was not being received the checks and the GST audit was not being received well, that they lost a point and a quarter. And since then, they've lost a whole nother point in a bit. So they went from losing a point and a half to losing about a point and a quarter. Terrible. They've dropped just about 3 points from November, which was, as we can see if we go back here, the high point they had since October. Since September, I mean. So 2-month high point, they're now at an all-time low. And as I've stressed on before, and I'll stress on again and again and again, the NDP is not picking up the slack. And we're actually at a position here where the two quote-unquote progressive, the three quote-unquote progressive parties, the Liberals, NDP, and Green, are roughly as popular as the Conservatives. It's about 44.4 to 44.3. We're at a stage here where even the most penultimate cope argument you can see from supporters, such as, oh, well, this is only a first past the post result, is dissipating. The Conservatives are not winning because of the election system. They're not winning because of funny games. They're not winning because the global economic situation. They're ultimately winning purely and only because of a combination of policy failures and the Conservatives offering solutions that people believe will fix them or mitigate them and can actually happen. One of the reasons why you see the People's Party languishing here at 1.6% is heavily to do with voters see the PPC's offering solutions that might possibly fix problems, though they don't believe the PPC can actually deliver those things. So there's no point in supporting them. There's no point in donating money, voting, because voters don't see that as a credible vehicle to deliver the change they want. Likewise, the Bloc is getting more donations, is getting more voters, is getting more support because people in Quebec see Blanchette as a good vehicle to defend Quebec's interest as the Liberals and the NDP collapse. In particular, against things like immigration, which is being conceived as seen as a significant threat, at least the rate of immigration. Just look at the Parti Québécois leader Paul St. Pierre Plamondon's rhetoric on the issue. And this isn't just going to dissipate. Every now and then you'll see people argue that the Conservatives are peaking too soon. And as soon as they say that, as soon as that is uttered unironically, their poll numbers increase by another point. Because the reason why the Conservatives are gaining ground is nothing to do with a polling fluke. The peaked too soon might be a compelling argument if the Conservatives peaked to like 40% just after Poilievre won the leadership race. And it was just a surge for a new leader. But it's been a steady climb for 2.5 years now. 2.5 years. A steady climb upwards. That tells us this isn't a fluke. This isn't, people are going to get learn about Poilievre and no longer like him and they're going to vote for someone else. The more people get to know Poilievre and his mission and his goals and his statements, the more they seem to want him to win. That's the only way you can interpret this. Unless, perhaps, your interpretation is the longer things go, the more people dislike Trudeau and Singh. Because this is a really important key point here. It's not that the Liberals are falling. It's not that Trudeau is failing. It's all of the opposition, every other party, save the Bloc, is floundering or in free fall, while the Conservatives are ascendant. The only reasonable interpretation of that is the Conservatives are doing something correct. Everyone else is doing something wrong. Now, why to belabor this point right now? Surely by this point, people who watch this podcast would understand this, right? And yes, I fully respect most of you probably understand this, though I do get a lot of new viewers, so the new viewers might not be familiar yet. But the reason I belabor this point here is there's a lot of news circling around right now about replacing Trudeau. And I know in my last video I said perhaps they should replace Trudeau. But I took the time off on vacation. I researched more. I did some more studying into polls. More polls came out. It's done. At best, the best leader the Liberals could deploy. We just conceive the best person. It's not doing any better. Angus Reid name tested Freeland, Carney, Joly, and someone else that I forget the name of. It's another one of the cabinet ministers, but is it Champagne maybe? I don't know. It doesn't matter. And they all do about as bad. Color me surprised. There's some plus and minuses there. I think Freeland is the quote-unquote strongest of the four. But not in any meaningful fashion that matters. Wouldn't change the outcome of the election in any way, shape, or form. And this is an interesting lesson in how political parties are structured. Not every party is the same. And in fact, the structure of parties is heavily tied to how that party's ideology is and the political system it's in. In first past the post, a right-wing party is going to be fractal. It is a hierarchy of hierarchies. This is really easily seen in the Conservative Party because there's different factions. You have the foreign policy guys. You have the budget hawks. You have the SOCONs. You have the right liberal types who want fiscal responsibility but they don't want social changes. There's a whole plethora of little factions. I couldn't tell you how many exist. You'd need to have a very good survey and understanding of the caucus dynamics and the national party dynamics. But there's clearly many different factions. And the way this manifests in a party, like the Conservative Party, is each of these factions has a leader. And that leader, in a properly functioning, healthy political party, is a lieutenant to the party's overall leader. So Pierre Poilievre, as the leader of the Conservative Party, has a bunch of lieutenants that are themselves the leader of an entire faction. Or perhaps high-ranking members of such faction. Again, you would need to have a very deep survey of the members of the party to really be able to map this in a proper fashion, but this is how it is structured. And to a certain extent, with Conservatives, this is inevitable because of how conservative worldview works. How a temperamental conservative works is, to a certain extent, they're deferential. Someone who has more experience or higher status is going to be deferred to by other members. So the newer, so for example, a junior SOCON is going to defer to one of the more experienced ones, like a Garnet Genus, or Genois, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Or a more junior person who's really concerned about foreign policy might defer to Michael Chong, etc. And that's how this structure works. And these people will spend time together. They'll hang out together and they'll form structures. So, in the event that Pierre Poilievre colossally screws up, there's actually people who have their own support structure to take over. That's one of the reasons why O'Toole could get fratricided so quickly in the Conservative Party. He could get taken out like that. Sure, the Conservative Party's adopted the Reform Act, which makes it easier to replace a leader. But even with the Reform Act, that wouldn't have been possible in the Liberal Party in the same way, shape, or form, which I'll get onto in a moment. But the way these factions work is that there is different people, and they have different beliefs, viewpoints, and goals. The right liberal and the SOCONs barely agree on anything. But the way it works in a big tent Conservative Party in the first past the post is the leader, his goal is to give both of those parties, both those factions, a reward. And that reward ensures their loyalty and ensures that they are going to keep with the government's agenda. And ideally, you give the SOCON something that makes them really happy but doesn't really bother anyone else. And then you give the right liberal something that makes them very happy and doesn't really bother anyone else. Or, if you have something, we'll go to the US for a second with the H-1B debate that has occurred over Christmas. You have the tech bros and the nationalists, and they have a very strong contention about H-1Bs. You get a compromise position. That makes both of them deeply unhappy, but it is the least egregious position. The least people are the least annoyed by it. And that's how right-wing political party dynamics work. If there is a contentious point, they will argue, they will fight. You'll often see this happen through surrogates in the media, and not necessarily because this is a cued thing. It's not like you're going to have Michael Chong over here saying, hey, in their Twitter poster, do the thing. That doesn't happen. But you have people who are aligned with that faction who will take of their own volition to do this, until possibly the person that they are, the leader that they see, the person they see as their leader, telling them to back down. And that fight will happen publicly. It'll be brutal, it'll be savage, and then at the end of the day, they'll make up and be friends again with the other side. Or at least tolerate them. And that's how right-wing parties are structured. In a multi-party system, such as proportional representation, this breaks up into several different parties. You look at Sweden, they have 4 right-wing parties. You have the Christian Democrats, you have the Swedish Democrats, you have the Moderate Party, and you have the Liberals. The Liberals are the right liberal types, or possibly libertarian types, depending on circumstances. I'm really oversimplifying here if any Swedes are actually watching this video. The Christian Democrats are the social conservative-ish types. The Swedish Democrats are the kind of nationalist, economic ambiguous party. So they're not really concerned about economics, they're concerned about protecting Sweden and the Swedish people. And the Moderate Party is your generic center-right party. It's vaguely liberal conservative. And so in a proportional system, all of these different factions break up and make their own parties, and the leader of that party, of that faction, is now formalized as a party leader instead of just being the informal lieutenant that is how the Conservative Party functions. In a left-wing party, like the Liberal Party, they do not have this structure, because left-wing ideologies are intrinsically egalitarian. A formalized hierarchical structure that requires deference of members to people on top would not float with left-wing parties. It would feel really wrong to them. That not everyone is equal at the table. So those parties do not have this system. And it's not an official cognizant thing. It's not something people sat down and said, okay, we're left wing, we should not do it this way. That is not how people like to organize in the left. No, this is just an innate thing. These are temperamental causes. This is just what happens when you have people with this temperament, and they structure a society or a government structure or an organization from themselves. That is how it is always going to end up being. There's vanishingly few left-wing parties that have meaningful factions. You can self-identify factions, say the Democratic Party in the US, but that's really more of an exception than the rule. Most of the time, the factions are going to be so small differences that it really doesn't matter at all. Like, for example, in the Liberal Party, you could say, oh, there's the social liberals, there's the blue liberals, there's the true liberals. And it's like, yeah, sort of. Yeah, maybe Carney's going to govern differently than Freeland. But we're not talking night and day. It's going to be very similar. John Turner was not that different from Craig Chen, who was not that different than Martin. Sure, Trudeau's different than those guys, but Craig Chen and Martin still support Trudeau, the Liberal Party as is. Maybe they would want something slightly different, or they don't agree with every single policy, but they still campaign for the party. They're not alienated. They're not kicked out because the party is a little different. It's still largely the same ethos. It's just different things are focused. One of the things I see people really, in my opinion, grossly misread about the Liberal Party is that Trudeau's taken it to a socialist position. It's not. There's nothing socialist about what Trudeau is doing. Trudeau is the epitome of the social liberal. If you understand what that is, you can watch my video on that about what is liberalism. But he is the epitome of that. He's perhaps the natural conclusion of liberalism in Canada. But to go back to the main point here, the way left-wing parties structure, and they will always structure this way, barring some really powerful liberal or like left-wing leader who can convince people to do otherwise consciously. But barring conscious effort from a very well-respected person, they will default to this structure, and that is a collaborative, first among equals position. In this case, Trudeau is the first among equals of the liberal circle. Now, that circle could be very small. Maybe it's just the cabinet. It could be very large. It could be the whole party. Some instances, this can turn soft imperialism, where we're going to call it the cabinet, dictates to the caucus what's going on. Other times it can be very democratized, where the whole caucus has a say. But the key note here is left-wing parties always have the people on the table and the foot soldiers. The people on the table are all are all equals, with the leader being first among equals. They all consent together. They all talk together. One of the reasons Freeland freaked out and left is Trudeau was undermining her position on the table and was trying to throw her away, first off the table, and second, was forcing her to do what he wanted despite her objections. So instead of the natural conclusion for a left-wing party would be them to agree on a compromise and then do that, or argue amongst themselves until they all agree, Trudeau did not do that. Trudeau, in a sense, tried to do a more right-wing thing and dictate downwards. That's not how left-wing parties usually work. And it's also not normally how Trudeau has worked. I think that dictation is kind of an anomaly. Now, it might seem dictatorial from the outside, because the Liberal caucus and the Liberal cabinet seem to basically just parrot whatever Trudeau's saying, but that's because behind closed doors, they've already hashed out and agreed to these things. And they present a united face to the public. So it looks like the leader is dictating. What actually happens is the leader sits down, talks to everybody, they come up to an agreement, and then that is their position. That is what they're doing. And this is why replacing Trudeau is extremely difficult. And in fact, since Freeland fired cannons, full broadsided Trudeau, I think it's now hopeless to replace him. And the reason there is there's not enough time. Every single person currently sitting as a Liberal MP in Ottawa cannot replace Trudeau. Not a single person in the entire Liberal caucus would be a good replacement. I don't care what your ideology is. I don't care what your beliefs are. No sitting Liberal MP would be a good replacement. And the reason for that is they all agree with at least 99% of what Trudeau has done. If you're disagreeing at the 11th hour with Trudeau, that doesn't mean you disagree with Trudeau being a Liberal MP. It means you are scared about losing your job. The current caucus revolts and turmoil is not a consequence of Trudeau finally screwing up, or he went one step too far. It's really a case of the caucus being like, wait a minute, we're screwed. We're screwed. The DST/check thing was a Hail Mary. It flopped really hard. Freeland then left cabinet. And now people are freaking out because it looks like the walls are, the party's collapsing. The ship is sinking. They just hit an iceberg. But in reality, they hit an iceberg 2 years ago. And now they just realized, oh crap, all of our watertight compartments are flooding. We should have done damage control 2 years ago. But now we're stuck floating in the North Atlantic with no power, and all the lights are out. The only person who could take the Liberal Party at this point and do better is an outsider. Someone who hasn't sat in office. In a sense, Mark Carney, of the four names that are being talked about, is probably the best option. Regardless of whether you like Mark Carney or not. Now, he has a bunch of baggage being a banker in this current circumstance, so it's probably not going to play super well. But no one else is going to do better than Trudeau inside his caucus. A lot of the hate Trudeau has is not because of what Trudeau is as a person. People will say, oh, he's narcissistic, or oh, he's dictatorial, or he's authoritarian, or he's self-righteous. Sure, maybe he's all of those things. But the reason people don't like Trudeau isn't his personality. They don't like Trudeau because his policies are not what they wanted. You can't look at Canada in 2025 and say, yes, the last 10 years has been great. Our GDP per capita has not grown in a decade. Huzzah! Housing prices the highest they've ever been relative to income. Success. Like, you can't point to anything, to the core things people care about and say, aha, success. And everyone else in the Liberal cabinet has agreed to these positions. They've agreed to what's going on, because these left-wing parties do not work this way. To circle back to something me and Wyatt Claypool have discussed many a time on my podcast, why are the NDP and the Liberals different? Now, there's all sorts of reasons. There's different ideologies, there's different things like this. But one of the core reasons they're different is the NDP leadership, their core table, does not agree with the core table of the Liberals. And with left-wing parties, when there's irreconcilable disagreement, they don't argue publicly. They don't have sparring clashes on Twitter. They don't argue with the CEO of the richest man in the world publicly. It doesn't happen. They disagree and they cannot reconcile their disagreement. They go home. They make a new party. They leave. That's why you look everywhere. There's usually more left-wing parties than there are right-wing parties. It's very, very rare to find the opposite. And usually when you can find places like, say, Sweden, where there is several right-wing parties, it's usually because it's a very open proportional system that allows this kind of fractal behavior. But even in countries, say, Germany, you have a generic liberal party in the FDP. You have a social democratic party in the SDP. You have a green party in the Greens. You have the CDU, which is the big tent conservative party. You have the BSW, which is the populist left-wing party. And then you have the AFD, which is the populist right-wing party. So even in an open proportional system, you can have a situation where you have 4 left-wing parties, or 3, depending on if you really want to call the the FDP not left-wing. They're definitely not right-wing. They're centrist, perhaps. They work with everybody, so that's why I say they're not right-wing, per se. And then you have the CDU and the AFD. Or you look at, say, France. In France, you have the LR, Les Républicains. You have Rassemblement National. And you could maybe say Reconquête. Maybe. It's hard to say if that counts as a full party as of right now. Because in France, you have all sorts of personality cult parties like the D'Habitants La France, which is Dupont-Ainon's personality cult party. It's pretty much just him. Then you have, in the center, you have Macron's party. Whatever it's currently called. I think it's Renaissance now. They change the name every time. Every year. And then on the left, you have the Greens. You have the Socialists. You have the Communists. You have the Populist Communists. So you have 4 distinct, clear, left-wing parties. And you have 2.5 right-wing parties in France. And a centrist party. I could keep going. You go, let's say the UK. You have the Tories. You have the populist right, which is the Reform. And then on the left, you have Labour. You have the Greens. You have the SNP. You also have Lib Dems, if you don't want to call it SNP left. But so there's 4 left, maybe 3.5 if you don't want to call SNP fully left, because they're nationalists, so they're not really the same thing. And you have 2 right-wing parties. Again, this pops up time and again because right-wing parties can internalize and handle dissent better than left-wing parties. The problem you'll see with right-wing parties is sometimes that internalized and handled dissent can cause them to just act like a left-wing party, like the UK Tories did for 14 years. And they'll betray their base time and again, because they do. However, that's why the Liberals are failing. It's not Trudeau. I don't think he can succeed. He probably should have left in the past. Not because he's the problem, just because it would give them a chance to reset the brand, bring in some new blood. However, Trudeau leaving always had to be with a non-cabinet replacement. As soon as you try to replace him with a cabinet minister, it's going to fail. That's what happened with the Ontario Liberal Party in 2022. They tried to replace Wynne with a cabinet minister of Wynne, and they got basically the same result, plus or minus some seats. They might do something vaguely interesting now because they brought in Crombie, who's slightly different. She's slightly fresher blood. Will she succeed? Probably not. But she'll probably do better than Del Duca. Maybe. Maybe. But make no mistake. If Trudeau does resign, and he is replaced, if he's replaced by someone else in the Liberal cabinet, the odds that they will do any different are astronomically small. The best case for, say, Freeland is she becomes the new leader, calls an immediate snap election, and tries to ride the temporary new leader bump to a better position. But let's say we get a Freeland in April or May, and she rides it out to October. She's not doing better than Trudeau would have if he rided it out to October. Just remember, when Del Duca got the leadership of the Ontario Liberals, he skyrocketed. He was beating Ford. And then he ultimately finished a distant third in seats. That's how this is going to be. You cannot replace an unpopular left-wing leader from a failing left-wing government with someone from their own inner circle in any meaningful time period. People might say, oh, but what about Craig Chen? He replaced John Turner, who replaced Trudeau. John Turner failed 2 elections in a row. Craig Chen really only shows up and succeeds. Everyone thought he was going to fail, by the way. There's a mythology now that Kim Campbell went into that election doomed. No, she just lost that election. She was polling neck and neck with Craig Chen. Mulroney wasn't even polling that badly when he stepped down. Kim Campbell just lost the election. She did bad. She had a bad campaign. But make no mistake, Craig Chen only won because Kim Campbell ran a bad campaign and Mulroney ran a bad government. If Mulroney ran an average government and Kim Campbell had an average campaign, it would have been a PC minority. Just combine a really bad 5 years with a really bad campaign and you get the worst defeat in Canadian history. At least the worst federal defeat in Canadian history. Maybe one of the provinces has a worse defeat somewhere. But with that, I bid you guys all adieu, and I'll see you next week with something different.